Okay, well, a number of points were made there. One of them that atheists have no consistent set of morals. Now, it's quite true to say that atheists, there are disagreements among atheists on how to behave, but then there are disagreements within religious traditions as well, as I've said. People do tend to agree on the basics. You know, practically all atheists will say that lying is wrong, that murder is wrong, that stealing is wrong. Just about everyone is agreed on the basics, and there are very obvious reasons for that. It's simply not useful for an organism to like being cheated against or lied to. So you can justify why. You can expect a consistent set of morals because these things are useful in all societies. Now, we spoke about the values we give to something. Let's look at languages. Now, a word has no objective value. Its meaning varies from one language to another. It's a bit like currency, really. A currency that's useful in one country could be useless in another one. But language is useful provided everybody agrees on it. But we're not going to, would you argue from that language must come from God, or that a particular language is right? The idea that was raised that gold coins have got intrinsic value. Well, if you're on a desert island and there's a ship in the distance, but you're starving, and I set before you some gold coins or some food, which has more value? The idea that gold coins are intrinsically, in this society, gold coins are worth a lot more than a bit of food because you can buy lots of food with gold coins. On a desert island, if you haven't got a choice, you can't buy food. If I gave you a choice between some food and some gold coins, which you could do absolutely nothing with, you would choose the food. Gold coins would be worthless. So this idea of intrinsic value is just blown out of the water by the desert island analogy. Again, it shows how the utility of something varies according to the environment you're in. The idea of intrinsic value falls down, I think. It doesn't survive scrutiny. The claim was made that caring for the weak is counter-evolutionary. Why is it that then that male balloons will bring up the rear of the troop and defend elderly and sick relatives, or sick members of the troop, not necessarily close relatives actually, against predators? Non-human primates will stick their necks out to defend weaker members of their own group. It happens. Being able to sense what other individuals feel is a useful thing in evolutionary terms. And once you have that ability, as I say, it acts as a natural brake to selfish behaviour. There's also a possible mechanism whereby a male is basically saying to females, hey, look how fit I am, I can afford to go and save all these weak members of the troop, that's how strong I am. So that would be an example of a male sort of demonstrating his fitness by doing very brave things. So again, you see the idea that it's easy always to spot good behaviour and selfish behaviour. I think maybe a bit more complex than we think. The point was made that if there's no soul, there's no such thing as free will. Well, if there is free will, there is no necessary connection between a person's past experiences and a person's environment, their past experiences, and their consequent behaviour. So free will weakens the idea that behaviour is determined by anything. If you have a code of ethics and you believe in free will, you've weakened the idea that that code of ethics determines how people will behave. The more deterministic you think the world is, then the more influence any code of ethics is likely to have. It was asked, why should we help others to get happy if it costs us happiness? But it certainly doesn't always have to cost us happiness. Most people are happy if they see that they're making other people happy. Most people feel sad if they know they've done something that makes other people sad. We are generally happy when other people are happy as well. The happiness, my happiness and other people's happiness don't have to be mutually exclusive. They're very often tied together. Spoke also about the idea that the idea we're all intrinsically equal. That's flawed. Well, obviously we're not all perfectly equal. So it was suggested that we should presume inequality rather than presume equality. The problem with presuming inequality is it's utterly useless unless you can say in what way people are unequal. If I say two people are on the same height, that's no use unless I can say by how much taller one person is than the other one. It's very complicated. For purely practical reasons, it doesn't make sense to presume inequality because you have to go and say something about how people are unequal. For purely practical reasons, it makes sense to presume equality. It's a basic simplifying assumption. And you said there's nothing equal about us if you look at the scientific basis of humanity. If individuals were very different, they would not be able to interbreed with one another. Members of the same species, because they share genes, are by their very nature similar. Biologists define things as different species if they're so separate that they can't interbreed. So there's a firm scientific basis, and we see that even in races that look very different, all different races can interbreed. We're all variations on the same theme. So there is a biological basis for the similarity that underlies all human beings, and I think for the ethical codes that are common to all human societies. It was said that religion offered a basis for morality, but as I said earlier, love your neighbour as yourself is a secular rule. It makes no reference to God. Now you can say that perhaps no one would have believed it had it not been for religious figures. Perhaps religion gives you a reason to believe something, but it's not the same as saying that it actually generates the code. It may a problem with religion is that it does give people strong reasons to believe things, but that unfortunately works for behaviours that you and I will both condemn as immoral. It works for those as well as the moral ones. It's a double-edged sword. Buddhism is a non-theistic religion, and the Buddha, despite the fact he said he didn't want to be worshipped, some of his followers went off and worshipped him, but he reassessed his life because allegedly he was born into a very wealthy environment, pampered, a very rich environment, and when he came out of that and looked at how different the lives of everybody else were, he was shocked by that. And to me there's nothing sort of transcendental about that. Again, it comes down to, well, he just saw how other people were behaving and was able to empathise with them. He saw a different environment, and that changed his perspective, perfectly down to earth. Confucius was a philosopher who advocated the golden rule again, without any reference to religion. Hume's idea that morals are just tastes, well, I don't think they are just tastes, they're useful tastes. In the same way that liking water is a taste, it's a useful taste. If you don't like water, or if you don't like drinking, you're going to die of thirst, you're going to die. The idea that something is if something's a taste, that doesn't have to demean it. It can still be a useful taste, a useful thing. So I question the idea that they're just tastes. Social Darwinism was mentioned. That's actually based on a misunderstanding of Darwinism. We now know that traits like empathy are very useful. The idea that in the long term the ends justify the means, let's kill off the weak for the good of the race, and so on. Well, what does God say? Let's have lots of evil in this world. It's necessary so that people can freely choose to be good. That's the argument by and large religious people use to justify the existence of suffering. So they would see that evil people are being used by God as a means to a greater end. God would appear to use evil as well. Whereas the basis of humanist ethics is that people should always be treated as an end in themselves and never wholly as a means to an end. Okay? Thanks.
All right, I'm going to respond to what he said in his presentation, and then in my next rebuttal, I'll respond to his rebuttal so that we can have some continuity here, so I can try and get all his points. In his presentation, he said that, where did God get goodness? Does goodness predate God, and so on? How do you define goodness? Well, essentially, as you said with one of your points, that God defines what is good by his commands. Good is defined as essentially that which agrees with God's will, and that which doesn't agree with God's will is not good. Now he said that he basically called why did God create evil or allow evil if he's essentially good or what have you. And you missed the point. You see, the point of this existence is not for us to enjoy ourselves, and the Christian assumptions of theology essentially God is all loving, and God is being all loving will never want anything bad happening to us. He wants us always to enjoy ourselves and be happy and so on. Obviously, if you believe that, the Christian narrative, then of course you're going to see a problem with the existence of evil. Whereas for Muslims and so on, the existence of what you call good and evil is neither here nor there. All that we see is our purpose, which our purpose is to follow the will of God. Just because other people don't follow the will of God doesn't mean that we have to not follow the will of God. And in fact, the more there is a test, and if we overcome this test, we get rewarded even more. So in fact, the presence of evil is an opportunity for us to overcome that and get even more good because there was the evil. If no one was starving in the world, where would the good come from, or feeding anyone if no one's starving in the world? I believe they call it second order good, as the philosophers say. In some cases, obviously, we are given free will. One could argue that in a kind of parent-child relationship, although I wouldn't use it the same way the Christians do, that sometimes the parent has to allow the child to experience the world for himself, sometimes to hurt themselves playing or whatever, and for them to learn. Sometimes the best way to learn is the hard way. It would perhaps be irresponsible of the parent to wrap up their child in bubble wrap and never let them out of the house, and then you do more damage to that child. He says, is murder and stealing a pencil equal because God says so? Again, I think you're basing a lot of your Christian theology. I'll say this. God values actions. He doesn't value all actions the same, or all disobedience the same. Some disobedience is worse than others, determined by God depending on what you've actually done. So for example, if God gives value to human life, God gives value to human life. If you take away human life, then you have committed a very big offense, a very big sin. God gives value to ownership of property, but not as much. An item, an object, does not have as much value as a living being. And hence, if you were to steal an object, it is not the same degree of crime. I think that should be very obvious to anyone that thinks about that. He said that people disdain from actions because God is watching. How is that morality? If you say, I'm going to do that because I'm going to get punished. Well, again, even in Islam, the highest form of goodness is to do things purely out of love of God, and there are different levels of why what motivates you. But that aside, it's one thing to do not to do an action because you see the punishment in front of you. You see the cameras, the CCTV cameras, you see the policeman, you see the guillotine, whatever. You see the punishment in front of you. Okay, I'm not going to do that. That's one thing. The other thing is to disdain from doing something out of fear of something you haven't seen before in life. That when you do an evil act, there is no punishment forthcoming straight after evil act. People who do evil acts and get the benefit from those evil acts, you don't see the punishment forthcoming for that. There is such a temptation to do the evil act because you don't see punishment. And remember, out of sight, out of mind. So trying to keep what is essentially an abstract idea, the concept of God, in your mind is actually very difficult, and hence that is the value derived from disdaining from doing a bad evil act, because you believe in this idea that you haven't seen directly. He said that people mock Christianity more than Islam as a side point. Well, that's because you've had many wars, bloody wars between Christians and humanists and what have you. And so essentially you've now disdained Christianity, you've debunked it, and now people, it's okay to attack Christianity. I have no problem with people criticizing Islam for intellectual purposes. Islam has no problem with people criticizing Islam. We had for 1,200 years wonderful debates between atheists, Jews, Christians, some of them writing very strong-worded language against Prophet Muhammad and Islam from within the Islamic State in Baghdad and Cordoba and so on, and no one was against them. So again, that was perhaps a side point which is not for this debate. He said that utility is a basis for morals. He said that in a group, morals are important. Yes, but you see, what if you're a dictator? Then morals aren't so important, because you now have control of the group. And they have to follow, they have to dance to your tune. Whereas all you now have to look out for is people who are a challenge to your power. And you have to deal with those people who are a challenge to your power by execution, torture, what have you, much like dictators do, very Machiavellian. And so, just being part of a group doesn't mean you're going to be moral. Sometimes you have an advantage which you'll use for your own advantage against others. He also said that behaviours have a genetic basis. Again, I really debunk that. So what? Then I could say cheating has a genetic basis, killing has a genetic basis. You're not really saying anything. So he said people cooperate for self-interest, and he talked about apes and so on. They would help the weaker members of their thing. And so yeah, okay, let's look at nature. Rats, when resources are scarce, will eat their babies. Even some poor human beings in the history of mankind have done the same. They didn't eat their children, but they buried their children alive, or they killed them because they were poor and they didn't think that they could survive. And then when the Quran came down to these people in Arabia, it said, do not kill your children for fear of want, God will provide. You have to have faith that God you haven't seen will provide for you and your starving child, whereas what you would have done before that, if you didn't know about this promise, would have been you would have killed your child. So Islam had to come down and prevent that from happening by giving people faith in something they couldn't see. It's like an atheist would think would be absurd if you want to make all the calculus, the materialistic calculus. He said that, again, animals will turn on each other when the resources are scarce. There are so many examples, I'm not going to cite one. People cheat if it's okay and they can hide it. But obviously, in a closed group, the animals will notice if they're being cheated against. Yeah, but in a big urbanized city, who's going to notice? People can steal from supermarkets and shops, and it's a victimless crime because no one's actually hurt. If you can get away with it, it's not a crime. I said that if chimpanzees were to don burkas, this system of reciprocal altruism will break down. Little dig there. One, I bet if chimpanzees don metal studs, punk hair, drag outfits and hoodies, the system would break down too. So again, that's neither here nor there, little small dig, didn't need in this debate. I always want to make a point, I like to see how burkas would affect moles or bats, which don't rely on visual sensory set of stimuli. He also said, treat people as you would treat yourself. Well, I'll tell you this, if I was a self-interested man with no morals, I would like to sexually harass maybe women. Why? Because I would love them to sexually harass me. I would love that. Treat people as you have yourself treated. I would love women to come to form queues and harass me and take me out and whatever. I'd love that. Please do it. If I was obviously not a Muslim and I was a self-interested individual. Of course. But women don't like that, but men do. So your axiom doesn't work. Sometimes people don't want to be treated as you yourself want to be treated. So it doesn't work. The other point which he mentioned, if I've got about a minute left, I'll start on the rebuttal ones. He said all atheists agree that murder is wrong. Okay, so what do you do with dictators and tyrants who torture their people, who kill people? What do you do with murderers? What do you do with them then? People that habitually murder, even if you lock them in prison, they will kill all the prison mates. What would you do with these people? Either you give isolation, or in some cases, in terms of dictators, you go to war. So you justify killing. So not all atheists agree that killing in all circumstances is wrong. In fact, in some cases, using utilitarian calculus, which Bentham and Mill did, colonialism, killing people for their own good, for the greater good, can be justified according to materialistic mathematical calculus of utilitarianism. It was applied to colonialism. He said that the language does not have an absolute basis. I say it does. It has a holy book. Language has a holy book. Each language, you know what it's called? A dictionary. Thank you.
Okay, we've said that God defines goodness by his commands. But if that's true, if something is true, if something is good simply because God defines it, then murder will be good if God said so, slavery will be good, anything will be good. It all becomes completely arbitrary. And the arguments are used about murder being worse than stealing pencils or being no worse than stealing pencils. It has nothing to do with Christian theology. It doesn't mention Christian God. It mentions God, but it was actually derived from Plato, who believed in God and lived before the time of Christians. So it wasn't derived from Christian theology at all. It was said that our purpose is to follow the will of God. How do we know if something's been well designed? We know it's been well designed if it fulfills its purpose. The fact that, according to Islam and just about every other religion, people are very good at turning away from the one true religion and embracing other faiths, means we weren't well designed. If we apply the same criteria of detecting design to God as we do to human beings, a product that failed more times than it worked, we would consider to be poorly designed. By those standards, then, the human race is poorly designed and God is a poor designer. You can't use the design analogy when it suits you and stop using it when it doesn't. The argument, well, I'd like to be ravished by women, so why don't I go around ravishing women? We need to elaborate that then. I'd like to be ravished by beautiful women who were very happy about having sex with me. I don't want to be ravished by ugly women who don't really want to be there. I want to be ravished by beautiful women who really freely want to have sex with me. Now, if I go around ravishing women who think I'm beautiful, and if we both freely want to have sex, there's no problem with that at all. Everyone's happy. Fantastic. So, there's no problem with that rule. But the idea I'd like to be ravished by women, you need to sort of pan it out a bit and make explicit more, what kind of women. And are these women happy doing what they're doing? Yes, they are. If everyone's happy, no problem. So I don't think this morality rule breaks down. I never actually said that love your neighbour as yourself was a perfect rule. I remember in my first talk I said, my first statement, I said that it was a good starting point for ethics. Not that it was a brilliant catch-all rule for determining how to behave. It was said that God values actions. Does that mean that if you are paralysed, you have no value? But you also said God gives ownership God gives value to the ownership of objects. He gives less value to objects that are owned than he does to living things. But you just said God values actions, and now you're saying God values objects. Well, which is it? Or perhaps it's both. Now you said, oh well, it's obvious, God gives less value, isn't it obvious that God gives less value to objects than he does to living things? But you haven't explained why he does. If God gives less value to objects because they can't feel, then you've just come up with a basis for morality that's nothing to do with God, or ultimately it's to do with more than God. It says that feelings are important. You've gone beyond just saying this is true because God said so. You've now gone outside of God. You say, well, this is true because God thinks feelings are important. So you're in a situation where you're no longer saying God is a sufficient basis for morality. If you're a dictator, you have control of a group. Well, that's true, but in order to get there, you have to be able to build successful alliances. You know, in the absence of morality, you would just get kind of chaos and nothing useful would happen. There are always going to be odd people in any society who, you know, you're going to get psychopaths, but you shouldn't have to come up with a philosophical explanation, rational explanation for that, because people aren't always rational. I mean, just as computers break down sometimes and do silly things through programming errors, people are kind of, if you think of them as being very complex machines, there's no reason why any system of ethics should be able to account for all the things that different people do. But by and large, a system of ethics should be able to account for what most people do, and most people think murder's wrong, stealing's wrong, and so on. You mentioned the little snipe I did about burqas it was related to the fact that people need to be identifiable in order to in order for certain systems of morality to work. And I quite agree with you that hoodies come under the same. And I will condemn hoodies for exactly the same reason there that I will condemn burqas. So I'm not coming up with an anti-Muslim argument, I'm coming up with an anti-concealment argument. Nothing, you know, there's nothing, not one rule for Muslims and one rule for everyone else. One rule for everyone, that's it. You quoted from the Quran about sort of killing baby. Oh, sorry, I'm out of time. Quoted from the Quran about don't kill babies because God will provide. Well, it's a fact that God doesn't usually provide, and you can't use quotes from the Quran. You can't use quotes from the Quran to convince non-believers because obviously it's not going to be any use. You have to believe in the Quran already for it to have any persuasive value. Okay, so.
Okay, again, I'm going to answer the points you raised in his previous rebuttal. I'm going to try and get all the points he made in his last rebuttal as well, as quickly as I can. He said that gold coins aren't intrinsically valuable because on a desert island, if you're starving and so on. They're intrinsically valuable, but you don't need that value at that particular time. You need the value of foodstuffs. Gold is intrinsically valuable because it has utility. It has something you can. It's something you can be useful. For example, for electric circuits, it's very valuable. Gold and so on can be used to connect electric circuits together, and many other things. It's an element. It's something that actually has a physical existence and has properties. Therefore, where those properties are beneficial, this is the value it possesses. Isn't that baboons defend the weak members? So isn't that counter-evolutionary? You know what? People defend weak members generally, even in social Darwinist systems. But when there are limited resources, and you're deciding who gets the resources, then when it comes to the crunch, the weak people shouldn't get those resources over those who are strong. That's what nature and evolution says, and almost all situations. He said free will weakens the idea of determinism. And I say no. You see, free will is a component of the human being. We can choose to engage with our emotions are sometimes automatic. You're walking down the street, it's summertime, let's say you're a guy, you see women who have exposed flesh. Whether you like it or not, whether you look away or not, you're going to have some enticement. There's going to be some enticement, some agitation. And so, this is something you can't control. But whether you want to pursue that woman or go back home to your wife is up to your free will. What the Quran says is that in theory everyone has free will. In practice, human beings choose to exercise their free will, to not exercise their free will, and just go with what their instincts lead them, and hence they cause lots of trouble to each other. He asked, why should we make other people happy? Don't we feel happy making other people happy? Tell me, how many adulterers felt happy about, how many adulterers used this criteria before they went and committed adultery on their spouse? How many adulterers use that criteria, saying, I'm not going to cheat my spouse, that would hurt my spouse? In this day and age, you need to think about yourself, individualism. You don't care, your happiness is your priority. You only live once, right? You only live once. So make the most of it, right? So if your spouse isn't doing it for you anymore and you have an opportunity, why not? If she doesn't know about it, then it's not sin. He said, we should not presume inequality, he says. And tell us an example of where's an inequality. This society is unequal. It is a meritocracy. If you are a genius, then you have more chance of being an engineer, of being a scientist, of being what have you, than a person who has Asperger's syndrome, for example. And that's just the inequality of it. If you are someone that's more physically capable, you can and taller, you can jump higher, then you have more chance of being a basketball player than someone who's short and can't jump that high to shoot a b-ball, so to speak, through the hoop, as they say. So life isn't fair. That's the famous axiom. So there's your inequality. He says that interbreeding makes us equal. Well, that's just arbitrary. Just because offspring can reproduce doesn't mean you're equal. A horse and a donkey can reproduce and produce what they call a jackass, which obviously can't reproduce itself. But they can produce something. Doesn't mean they're equal necessarily. Although some people say that maybe the fact that all animals can interbreed, not necessarily each other, but the fact that they can interbreed in the first place makes all people equal. And there are some animal rights activists that argue that animals and human beings are equal because we are all living organisms. So there's a problem with that. Then obviously we can't kill cows for our meat. He says that Buddhism is not theistic, it's just common sense, or what have you. Yeah? Okay, so karma and nirvana is something that atheists can believe in. So atheists can believe in karma then? No. You can't, because there's no such thing as some transcendental justice system called karma. You don't believe in that. So please, just because Buddha doesn't believe in God doesn't mean he's shooting for your side. He said morals are a useful taste because morals have a use. If you're good to people, you can reproduce and you can be whatever offspring. Okay, fine. Let's say I'm homosexual. Tell me how useful that is in the evolutionary scale of things. How useful is that? Yeah, will it help me reproduce? No. No use at all, no utility at all. He mentioned some other points. Yeah, I don't have time for these other points because my 5 minutes is up, but please ask me questions on those points and I will answer them. Thank you.
Please